Okay, good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. And it is the start of our bare root rose season. So we'll be explaining to you how to take care of these, how to set them up. Generally, this is what we're selling, or this is what we'd like to sell everybody, something that looked about like that. That's one of the nicer bare root roses that we have, but certainly some are smaller. And there are totally different roses that grow a different pattern. So you see this one's quite thin, but it's normal, how it looks normally. So one of the things that people ask us, they want roses they can cut, and that is the most popular rose we sell. I mean, the most popular rose in the United States would be a landscape rose that grows along the sides of roads. Those are sold, thousands at a time, but we like the cutting roses that have, this one flower makes a statement. And those would include the hybrid teas primarily. And the ones they call grandiflora. And then we have what are known as the landscape roses. And their individual flowers may not be sometimes they are pretty nice, but they're not quite as unique. But they're there to provide a lot of color. And those would be the Floribunda, and the Polyantha. And there's a lot of other names that are used: drift roses, flower carpet roses. There's quite a few that fit in, well, the other category down here is called shrub. Shrub's supposed to include anything that's not a hybrid tea. Grandiflora, Floribunda is called a shrub. So polyanthas and a whole bunch of other types of roses are in the shrub category. Okay, so the difference on the growth patterns of these, most hybrid teas are upright plants, and you can say the average is 4 to 5 feet tall by about 3 foot wide, and they bloom generally, ideally, single flowers at the tops of their stems. The grandifloras are roughly the same, but they usually have clusters of flowers at the tops of their stems. And then the floribundas, generally they're going to be shorter, say 3 foot high and 3 foot wide, and they generally have clusters of flowers. Polyanthas, a lot of them are more moundy plants with big clusters of tiny flowers. But the shrub category can include just about anything under the sun, shape-wise. Oh, of course, we also have climbing roses. And climbing roses generally have longer stems. So we'll say average climber 10 foot long. And you can train them up or sideways. The majority of climbing roses probably bloom better when you grow them sideways than straight up. Now, most people like to put roses in beds so that they're all together, and that can look better generally also. However, it also makes more diseases and pest problems. So if you put, if you just have one rose in one bed in your house, it may not get any bugs or diseases. If it's isolated like that with no other roses nearby, the diseases may not find it. Most diseases that roses catch, the spores float in the air. And the chances of getting a single rose and among other plants is not as high, and the chance of a bug finding that plant is lower too. If you have 20 or 30 roses in one spot, bugs find their target by smell. They'll smell that group of roses and go after it. The diseases have an easier time if there's a whole bunch of roses around. As diseases spread, the disease itself gives off spores. Any rose nearby can catch it too. Plus, if they're in contact with each other, if the roses are actually touching each other, it makes it even more susceptible to bugs and diseases. So, you certainly can put your roses in beds. Generally, we like to space them about 3 foot on center. That means the center of one rose is about 3 foot in the center of another. There's no rules there either. I mean, I've put them closer. If you want a hedge of roses, you can put them closer than that. If you want to space them more so that you have better air circulation around each rose, get fewer diseases and pests, you can certainly go farther. I remember I was at a rose garden in Malibu, which along the coast, it'd be real famous for mildew, but they had their roses 10 feet apart. So with that air circulation, plus they were not close to any buildings at all, then you're not likely to get diseases that like high humidity and bad air circulation. So that helps too.
For isolated roses that aren't dead, what would be the minimum distance? Mine are dotted throughout on my side of the lawn.
Well, the size of the rose, I mean, there are some roses that are quite different in size than others. Yeah. I mean, some shrub roses can grow. Oh, it's just by wind.
Yeah,
they said, according to the research, they said there's no place in the U.S. that isn't exposed to rose spores of all the diseases. So you can't escape them, but the fewer roses you have in one spot, the better the chance of the spore not finding it.
So by the Malibu standard, you should be pretty good with that evidence that they didn't have the mold.
Well, I didn't know if they were treating them. I didn't talk to the homeowners. And this was like 40 years ago, so I don't recall too much of the details. Okay, so in general, if you do set up a garden with rows of roses, you can put roses back to back, in a double row, but don't go any deeper than back to back. You've got to be able to reach. So the main thing we have to do with roses is deadhead the flowers, cut off the flowers after they bloom. Makes it look better, and it stops them from making seeds, which uses up a lot of the roses' time and energy. So back to back rows, don't make them any deeper than that. So you can set them up that way. You can set them up, in kind of offset, a zigzag type setup. Some people like to put tree roses in between these to even put more roses in there. Tree roses are just roses with a 3-foot trunk with the rose growing on top of it. We do sell tree roses also, but we don't sell them bare root. So floribundas, polyantha roses, we often use in the front yard, even along the edge of the yard, because they're short enough that you can usually see above them. Whereas the hybrid teas and grandiflores, you can put them at the back of the front yard, but a lot of people put them in the backyard because they're fairly tall. They kind of obscure the view behind them. Now, among hybrid teas, there are shorter ones. Among grandiflores, there are short ones, and there are tall ones in there too. Some roses like to grow 10 feet tall. And also the conditions that you give them to grow will also determine a lot of the height. So I didn't put down miniature. So miniature would be in the miscellaneous group too. We actually have a rose that we sell that's out there that's considered a miniature. Miniatures are usually 2 foot or less in height, flowers 2 inches or less in size. In Southern California, a lot of miniatures grow taller and bigger than that because our growing season never stops. And I have used miniatures as landscape roses also. So in planting roses, the soil, now the nice thing about roses is they're very tolerant of bad conditions. About the only thing they're not tolerant of would be waterlogged soil. So if your soil just stays really wet, they're not real happy with that. Although if the soil is not done wrong, they'll probably still do okay. What we mean by not doing wrong is most literature will tell you to put a lot of compost around roses. Even from our own rose suppliers, they'll tell you, put a lot of compost in the hole. We do not recommend any compost, so no compost. That is counterproductive as far as root health goes. No compost amendment, just put it that way. We like compost around a rose on top of the ground, so if you got a rose planted, roots going like this, we want the compost to be on the surface of the ground in a real thick layer. But not in with the roots. And generally, the rose plant itself does not like compost touching it. The stems are meant to tolerate it. But any other part of the plant, it doesn't want to be next to compost, because what is compost? It's rotting plants. Generally, it's rotting plant material. And anytime you have rotting things next to living things, think of it as if you had rotting animals on your bed. That's not where you want to live. You don't want that potential disease and bacteria in the rotting stuff to be right next to your living things. In nature, this is where it belongs, on top of the ground, 5 inches deep or even deeper than that. 5 inches is supposed to be average in nature. So compost on top of the ground after you're done planting, but in the soil itself, no, don't put it in there. If you don't put it in there, too much water will probably not have any effect on the roots unless it just sits and sits and sits. They probably can't do well in a pond, but roses do like water. Back in the day when I didn't know this about amendments, in a bed that stayed really wet, with the amendments in it, the roses just sulked. In the bed that had amendments in it that drained really well because it was raised up, the roses did just fine. So we do not recommend it, but roses can live in compost. I mean, they're really tolerant of that. Most roses that are sold in containers are growing in compost. So they're quite tolerant of that. They'll look better without it, but they're quite tolerant of it. So for soil, pure sand, pure clay, either one works. Generally, roses grow slower and shorter in clay, and they grow taller in sand and grow faster in sand. So if you want to make your soil, so the more air in the soil, the faster things grow. Most florist roses, companies that grow roses for the florist industry, grow them in pure sand. So now,
Like sand at the beach.
well, that type of sand, right? They get it out of riverbeds, but beach sand would be too salty. Although I think roses can probably tolerate the salt better than a lot of plants. But pure sand, they grow tall. I mean, the problem is the more area of the soil, they may grow taller than they're supposed to. So one of our customers said he spent 10 years as a oil consultant in Saudi Arabia. He had his motorhome parked on the sand, and he wanted to grow roses. Everyone told him he was crazy. He said his roses grew much taller than his trailer. And so he learned about what sand does to plants. And that, again, that's why florist roses are grown in sand, because they'll get the really long stems. And the longer that stem grows, the bigger the flower gets too. So in clay, everything's slower and shorter. So I redid a rose bed once with sand, and my floribundas were 5 foot tall. It's like, okay, that's too tall. I won't do that again. They were a lot taller than they should have been in that sand. So they looked really healthy though. Okay, so no compost amendments. So again, the looser you make your soil, the faster and bigger they'll grow. It's not essential. They do need good drainage. They do like good drainage. So if you raise your bed up, that does help them, even just a few inches. I remember I had the area I had that was below. I had one area that was below sidewalk level, and so it didn't drain well at all. The water just kind of got caught by the sidewalk, and the roses there stayed really small. What we did is we added more dirt and raised it above sidewalk level, and suddenly the new roses that went in there did a lot better. So good drainage, ample water. Those are some of the keys. Try to keep them away from a solid wall. So if you have a block wall or your house wall, if they're within 5 feet of that, they tend to get a lot of mildew in our area because our springs are so humid. And if they don't have good air circulation because of a wall blocking it, we noticed everything within 7 foot of my house got mildew real bad in the spring. Anything beyond that did not. So that made a huge difference on mildew, just the airflow. Okay, so when we plant the bare rose, so bare roses are grown in the ground in the Central Valley. When we get them, they kind of look like this. What you want to do is cut off anything that's broken. So here I've got a broken root. So we'll trim that off. Saw another one here somewhere. Here's another broken root. Sometimes if you shake it, the broken stuff vibrates more, but this one's definitely cracked, so we'll cut that off where it is. We want to leave as much root as we can, although sometimes, here's another broken one. If it's this long, it's kind of ridiculous to make a hole just for that root. You can try to bend the root around or cut it off if it's, but you don't want to make, the roots are important, so you really don't want to get rid of too much of it. Now you can wash the dirt off if it's got a lot of mud on like this one does. You can wash it off. It actually helps them a bit to wash that mud off and get it in contact with your dirt. The thing that this mud will contain is severed roots from the roses that were nearby, because in the Central Valley when they grow these roses, the roses are about this far apart in the ground, 2 or 3 inches apart. So this has a lot of dead root from the rose that was sitting next to it. So if you get rid of this, it helps somewhat. It's not going to be major, but we found that if we do that, we get slightly better results than if we leave it. Yeah, just with water off the hose, right? There's a cracked root right there. We took that one off. And then now this year the weather all year has been quite humid. We haven't had much dry weather at all. We're not expecting it this winter. However, the biggest problem is when you plant these, and you can see on this plant where the green stops and the brown begins, that's the soil level, the original soil level. If the stems are sticking up like this, it takes about 2 weeks for the roots to grow their root hairs so they can pick up the water once you plant them. In that 2 weeks, if we have a really bad Santa Ana, these things can shrivel up like prunes, and then they're in trouble. So the shorter you cut these, the less likely they are to shrivel. When we pot them into containers here, we don't do any protection, so we usually cut them down to about 6 inches or less, just for that reason. But I would say for the longer the stem you leave, the more flowers you'll get the first bloom, but the more likely it is to dry up and not grow at all. So there's a compromise here. It's nice to cut them down, say at least to 8 inches.
So after we get them from you, cut them again?
You may not have to. They may have already been cut. And you can ask our employees to cut it if you like, if they haven't been cut. But generally, we've already cut them to about 10, but you can go shorter than that.
If you have an existing root plant and you're trimming it back for this time of year, you want to cut it down to like 6 or 8 inches?
Depends what you want the plant to. I'll talk about that too. So this is about how I would cut it. Now, if it does start blowing on you, the wind comes up, the option you have to avoid having to cut any shorter. So let's say you put in the ground, the plant looks about like this. Now, just, this is a grafted plant. And grafted plants have 2 roses connected to each other. So this stem here and the roots is from a rose we call Dr. Huey. It's a climbing rose that's thornless, and they use that as the trunk and the roots. They usually plant a stem of Dr. Huey in the ground in the winter. It grows roots. It grows a top. They come back in June of that same year, cut the top off, slit a slit on the side of the trunk, and insert the bud of this rose they wanted to grow and let it grow out. That next winter, they cut it really short again, so it starts to grow new branches right at the part where it was grafted. So you got all these branches come out right at the graft point. So this is the rose we want. In this case, this is Chicago Peace. This is not the rose we want. So if anything grows out of here, or out of the dirt, out of the roots, it's going to be a totally different rose. Now, so this was the original soil level right about here. Now, if this was sold in Minnesota, they would plant it about this deep. Because if this is sticking above the ground in Minnesota and it gets down to negative 40 degrees, you'll kill this part. It'll just freeze. And then all I have left is the root system. You can. So back in the 80s, my first rose garden, I had read that in Minnesota they do this anyway, so why not in Southern California just do it and bury it? So I said, okay, I'll try that. So I buried my roses that deep, and they did fine. There was no other issues. Right, just left them buried deep. Right. And when I dug some out a few years later, they had rooted all out of their stems. So there's no rules here. You can bury it deep. They'll still grow just fine. Or you can leave them like they originally said, which is like this. And then if the wind blows, you can, get the ground around it real wet, take all that mud and just pile it up on the stems to protect the stems until you see the sprouts starting to come out. And then you can, once the sprouts come out, the roots have regrown the root hairs, and then you can just wash this off or leave it. It's up to you. You can just wash the mound right off if you want to expose this area, or you can just leave it up there if you want to. The most important thing to tell you is do not use compost to cover this stem. Compost eats the new leaves coming out. Its job in nature is to eat up plant material. Because I did that one year. I said, okay, I don't have dirt this year. I'll just put compost around it. And then when I uncovered it, I noticed all the leaves were very laced out. They had just been consumed by the compost that I had covered them with. So you do not want to cover living parts of your plant with compost. That's definitely not good for the foliage. It's trying to eat it up. So just the mud. Now, LA Times had an article a long time ago saying, well, okay, if you don't have enough dirt, you can make a cylinder out of newspaper. Now, not everybody buys newspaper anymore, but you can take a newspaper and kind of make a cylinder out of it, tape it up, and put it over the rows and throw dirt down the cylinder so that you can cover the rows with less mud than if you just mounded it. In fact, just covering it with a cylinder of newspaper alone would keep it a lot more humid in there. That may be all you have to do. Or if you have, a cheap moving blanket, cut it up and throw it on top. Keep it wet. Moving blankets absorb water. Once they absorb water, they stay wet a long time. So.
Now, again, when you cover the tent, say up to 4 inches, when you leave it, then root hairs will spring off of the
Oh yeah.
cane, so that the basic trunk doesn't really have to be exposed.
No. No, if you bury this, it'll just root out all along that.
So obviously, I'm covering the cane because I got a little slope and a huge pile of dirt up there. I'm piling, so I don't have to do that.
You don't. Now, the only problem that might occur, if the roots on roses generally grow about 1 foot deep or less. It depends on the soil. In sandy soil, they'll grow 2 or 3 foot deep. In clay soil, they might grow 8 inches deep. If you start burying it deeper and deeper, then these roots down here start dying off. They're just too far down. But yeah, you won't have any problems, right? You won't have any problems. Yeah, that was from an article in the LA Times in the 80s too. They said, why don't we bury roses deep? So you can plant them that way. Make sure they get going. So you can see if we have a tree rose, it'd be really hard to keep the stems moist. What they recommended was wrapping green moss around this thing, where you're spending $20 for the green moss to wrap the top. It's just easier to let us start them for you here at the nursery. We keep them in a real quiet corner where there's no wind. Get the tree roses started and then plant them. So, okay, so one thing you do have to worry about when you're planting roses in a rose garden is when you replant the rose. Just so you know, grade 1 roses, would be a grade 1, but it's a grade 1 plus, because a grade 1 rose, this is a grade 1 rose here. The top grade is to have at least 3 stems that are the size of pencils, thickness of pencils. So this has 3 stems minimum. That one little tiny guy is a little bit skinny, but this is a grade 1 rose. This has got what, 8, 9 stems the size of pencils. So this is, in the old days back in the 60s and 70s, every rose we sold looked like this because they grew them in the ground for 3 years. Now they only grow for 2 years. So you get a lot of these.
Sometimes when you have, like, say, grade 1, a lot of times in the roses you'll get other canes that are smaller coming, or like a lot. Will they eventually mature into
maybe, maybe not. So a lot of the skinny canes that come off roses, sometimes they're not very good stems. Uh, it's hard to tell you why that is. I don't know. But generally, if they come off the base of the plant as a thick stem at the start, that's your thick ones. The ones that start skinny often don't ever get big.
That's funny because on one of my roses, the rose broke off one of the things, and it has smaller ones. I just
Mhm.
never decided. So I guess there's no way of knowing.
Yeah, you don't know. Sometimes they'll grow branches off the skinny ones that are thicker, but generally, if they come off close to the base, they'll be better. So these are both grafted roses. This rose is called own root rose, so it's a cutting. So this rose, they just took a piece of rose, so long, stuck it in a pot in a greenhouse and let it grow. If you kind of imagine it, you can see where the original pot was. It was a pot about that tall. They stuck the cutting in there and it rooted out. And then for the second year of this plant's life, they stuck it, the container rose, pulled out the container, stuck it in the field to let it grow its root system. So this rose is on its own roots. They're doing this more and more for more roses because if you live in Chicago or Minnesota or any place, they'd rather have this than a grafted rose because on the grafted rose, you always have a chance of losing it and ending up with the rootstock, which is a different rose. On this plant, if you can lose the entire top, if the roots start growing for you, it's exactly the same plant. Now, the reason they still graft roses is because not all roses make their own roots really well. Some roses, they're so slow on rooting that it's not worthwhile for the rose company to root it and try to sell it. So there's certain roses that they still graft because that's the only quick way to grow them. But any rose can grow from a cutting, but some are just not as good as others. That's
I noticed the canes on that are a lot skinnier. Is that the nature of the rose or the fact that it's
both. Stone root roses aren't in the field as long. They're only in the field for 1 year because they were in a greenhouse for 1 year. So a lot of the own root roses have skinnier stems than the others, but in this case, this is a polyantha rose, which is one of those ground cover roses with skinny stems. Miniatures were developed from polyantha roses, so. But great roots on this rose. And on this plant, we'd probably cut out, thin it out a little bit. You don't need all these skinny things. Again, the more branches you have, the longer they are, the less chance of sprouting out quickly. They might shrivel up on you, so we would thin this out a bit. Perhaps something about like that. Might get rid of this one also. So generally, you don't have to start with that many branches. I mean, there are buds every few inches on here, which will be a new branch, potentially a new branch. So you can see, even if you only leave 3 branches, you'll have 5 branches coming off each one of those branches, and that's plenty of branches on a rose plant. But again, it depends what you want your rose to do. So since we're on the topic of pruning, I mean, for most roses, a pair of pruners is just fine. Occasionally, you'll want a skinny saw to get really thick branches, or if you have stems right in between other stems, you want to get rid of it, a skinny saw will get in there easier than your loppers or your pruners. So the goal on pruning roses, roses do fine if we never prune them. They would do what they want if we never prune them, but they may not look like you want them to look. That's the thing. We have, I know the rosarians 40, 50 years ago kind of set standards for how they want roses to look. You know, they want them to have a nice vase shape with big flowers in at each branch. Now, if you go to England and you buy some of the English roses, they'll tell you, no, that's all bull. They don't want you to prune the roses at all. They want the roses to keep on branching, 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 branching. So you get something that looks like this. And they'll have really fat canes on their plants. Here, we like the nice thick canes, but not covered in bark, and not, you know, we like them green and fresh looking, whereas the English rose, you get all this bark starting to grow. Well, what we found out is that if you grow the roses we sell like this, they start making flowers look like English roses, which is really interesting. So that was done at Huntington Gardens back in the 1980s and 90s. They had this curator taking care of the roses there that decided he would follow the English style of growth. So he started taking all the American roses and training them like this, leaving them this tall in the winter, not pruning them much at all, maybe thinning them out a little bit. But he'd have stems on the roses that were that thick. And I went there in the spring, like 5 years down the road when he was doing this, and looked at their roses. They had a lot more flowers on them, but they didn't resemble anything that we were selling. And that's supposed to be double delight. It looks nothing like double delight. It had about 100 petals on the rose. It was so many petals that it didn't have that nice spiral anymore. It wasn't like that. It was like a cupped flower from England. Those real heavily petaled flowers. And I didn't recognize any of the roses they had at Huntington Rose Garden, because they had all attained an English rose style. So David Austin in England, when he sells his rose, says don't prune them for at least 3 years, because we need to get the branches thicker to make English flower, to make that really nice heavily petaled English flower. So that's the difference. If you want, you know, the confused center, cup center, quartered flowers, that style of growth, you don't prune them at all. You just let them get real woody in there. If you want the nice spirals that are, you know, preferred in the U.S., you make new stems from the ground as much as you can. New stems make the spirals.
During a growth cycle, when you have the canes like you have there, as they mature, they're going to sprout. They're going to sprout. In other words, it's not always a single cane. It's going to get multiple.
Right.
When you get ready to prune your roses, if you want to prune them, is it hurt to cut them all the way back the way they were, or do you have to leave a certain amount of the sprout?
Well, you don't need to leave much. So there are.
Can you consistently every season cut them back like that?
Yes.
That'd be okay?
Yes.
You know, like eventually those are going to have taller canes.
Right, they'll have stems coming all around. So what happens, there's buds on this stem, and you can tell where the leaves are attached, that's the growth bud. And so what florists do, because florists want the really long stems, the longer the stem grows, the bigger the flower at the end of the stem. So they want that. So after this flower blooms, they'll cut the stem down to one of the last buds on that same stem. Yes. Well,
Sometimes they're hard to see.
Right. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but if you cut off all the buds, then there's no place for that stem to come to regrow. So, right. So you want to make sure that you can see on a stem, where the leaf was attached, there's a little line there that goes about halfway around the stem, and above that line is a little bud. In fact, there's not one, there's several lined up around that center big bud, and if you trim off anything up here, this bud will grow in that direction, the same direction the leaf was facing. Is actually attached right here to this branch. So there's a bud right at the base of where that is that's facing this direction. Now, so supposedly you can shape your rose by cutting to the buds pointing the right way. Occasionally when you do that, like here's the bud facing this way, so I want to cut this out here to make the branch go this way, not this way. Occasionally they don't follow that rule. You cut it to that bud and this bud sprouts. But usually the bud at the top of the stem will then grow. So the taller you leave the stem, the more branches can potentially grow. The shorter you cut them, the bigger the flowers and longer the stems you'll make. The two extremes back in the 80s and 90s, well, Huntington Gardens left theirs 4 foot tall in the winter, about like this. And if you go to Rose Hills and Whittier, all theirs this time of year are cut about 6 inches up. Really short, it's like ankle height. That's the shortest I've seen locally, is at Rose Hills. You go to Rose Hills in the spring, it's just a wonderland of rose. The roses look really good over there. They do a good job. So I like to cut at least the hybrid tea short. You would cut generally we leave the floribund, the roses where you want lots of little flowers, just leave them taller. And you can leave more stems on them. If you want fewer, bigger, longer stem roses, you cut them shorter. So the hybrid teas, it doesn't sound proper, but the hybrid teas, we should cut those shorter. And the floribundas, we usually leave them taller. Because we want numbers of flowers, not necessarily longer stems and fewer, bigger flowers. But there's no rule set in stone. So, in the old days, we had entire pamphlets written on how to prune a rose properly, the angle of the cut, the number of stems you leave, the shapes of these stems, all that. They have rules for that the rosarians from England and the U.S. made these rules. And then in around 2000, when roses were at their peak around the 1980s. That's when everybody, there was the rose catalog sent to every household in the U.S. by Jackson and Perkins Rose Company at that time. Every household got a rose catalog. So roses, Jackson Perkins was selling 20 million roses a year, or 16. I think they picked out around 16 or 18 million roses a year at that time. And then the popular roses started to decline all the way through the 90s and 2000s. And at that point, a lot of the rose gardens, the public rose gardens, didn't have enough volunteers to help prune their roses. So they had to come up with better methods or quicker methods to prune them. So then they sent out a pamphlet showing how you prune a rose with a chainsaw. So you take your chainsaw and you kind of cut from a down below upward angle like this. Not down, but from the bottom up. You cut through a chainsaw. So they actually did a study in England saying, well, if we're using chainsaws and machines to cut roses, what's it doing to the quality of the flowers? So they took, in England, they ran this for 5 years. They took 50 roses, and on this side, 50 roses over here, exact same rose. This was pruned by the best rosarians in England. This was pruned by a machine that just hacked the tops off every month or so. And they wanted to count the number of quality flowers they got on each side. best quality flowers. They had no difference with blind cutting machines or humans cutting these roses as good as they found no difference. So they ran another 5 years. They said, this can't be true. Humans have to be able to do this better than machines. And they ran another 5 years and they got the same results. Just the fact that they deadheaded the roses on this side, they made just as many good flowers as this side. That was being done meticulously by the rules, by humans. They got no difference. So now nobody seems to care as much about how you prune them. As long as you get those spent blooms off of there, you should be okay. So all the rules we used to use, we don't use now. Florists still use the rule where if you get the stem that grows 3 foot and has a bloom at the end, they'll cut it all the way down to here so that they get the same stem back with the really long stem, because they need the stem length too when they sell roses. Okay, so when we plant them and you get the foliage going, then it's pretty much time to start fertilizing them. So you want to wait till the leaves come out. Once the leaves are out, get them fertilized. In the ground, generally a good organic fertilizer. This brand, Dr. Earth, Down to Earth are two of our favorites, although there's a lot of good fertilizer out there. The organics in the long run are best. Now, if you grow them in a pot, I should have brought a big pot in here. Forgot to. So you can grow, roses are good in containers, but they've got to be pretty good size. The average rose will fill a half barrel. That's a 25-gallon bucket. And I would say maybe a 15-gallon for some of the smaller roses, but 20, 25-gallon for the bigger roses, something this big, because the rose is going to grow, that wide and about that tall in a container. Now, again, roses are real tolerant of bad potting soil. So even if you use the cheapest potting soils out there, you'll still get a decent looking plant. You'll get a better plant if you use our potting soils. We'll plant our roses in either our top pot or our acid mix, either one. They work well on both. If you have a half barrel, it's going to take between 3.5 bags to fill it. 25 gallons, that's about 8 gallons in there. So it takes more, at least 3 bags, but a little more than 3 generally. And just so you know, in containers, especially with our potting soil, these will start a little bit slower because there's no nature in our potting soil at the moment. In the ground, there are bacteria and fungi in the ground at your house that will fairly quickly consume this stuff and get it to the plant. In a pot, it may not happen for quite a while, and if you want to grow faster, we start them off here with Osmocote, which is a chemical time release. Works the next day. Well, they have, the instructions are to mix it in to the top few inches. We throw it on top because if you mix it in the top few inches and you're doing 50 rows at a time, you'll go back and look and go, did I fertilize it? So then you have to start digging around and check for it. So we just throw it on top, and then when we water it, we expect to mix it in with the water. So that's how we do it here, just so we know we fertilize it. You can still see a few of the pieces floating on top. Otherwise, but yeah. In fact, most roses, when we get them from the growers, they claim that they can grow 3 or 4 months without any fertilizer at all because they were well fed before they pulled them out of the ground. So this is not critical to do immediately. Now, at my own house, what I ended up doing, which worked just as well, now I would prune my roses back in the spring. So traditionally in Southern California, it's always been December, January. We used to get winters that would be cold enough to make them drop their leaves and go to sleep. I mean, we did back, well, when I first started gardening, it was in the 1980s. And the late 80s were the coldest winters on record in California. Now, again, we've only been taking records since about 1870, I believe, is when they started taking records. So, that's only, in the span of history, that's nothing. But the coldest temperatures recorded in California were in the late 80s. 1990 was the coldest temperature ever recorded in California. It was 13 in San Francisco, 23 here. And that was enough. It put the roses to sleep. They dropped their leaves in December. And that was then the right time to prune them. But with the temperatures we're having right now, which is 50s at night, 60s in the day, they'll bloom. That's the spring weather. They'll just keep blooming and growing throughout winter. Just leave them alone. Yeah, well, you don't have to prune a rose. The rose doesn't really want you to do pruning anyway. But they had an article in the LA Times again, from the same guy from back east saying, why do we cut our roses back in the middle of winter? When the worst weather on the roses, all that rain is in the winter. Why don't we just leave them alone all winter long and prune them like we do, like in New York, where I came from? We prune them in the spring. After all the snow has melted, we can see what damage occurred. So I go, well, that makes some sense. I mean, the rainy winters cause most of the disease problems, rust, black spot. That's caused by the winter rains. So I said, well, let's just start pruning in the spring. So I would just leave my roses blooming and growing all winter. And come spring, now spring on my roses was when all the bare stems at the base of the rose started growing new growth. That usually happens late March to early April. All this new stuff starts to emerge. You go, okay, it's time. It's acting like spring. Cut off all the old stuff down to the new stuff. Pull off all the diseased leaves. Anything that has orange spots from rust or black spots, black and yellow from black spot, get rid of that. And my rose now is totally clean. Fresh start. It doesn't usually rain much after April. I mean, it might this year with an El Nino going on. It might rain until the latest we've seen it was all the way into June one year, and that was around 94, 95, and then 96, 97, and then 98. We had 3 years in the 90s where it rained all the way into June. So there, you couldn't do anything about that. But most likely it'll not rain too much after April starts. So you pull off all your diseased leaves in April. It takes the new growth a month before they're susceptible to any of those diseases again. And by that time, the weather's dried up and you're fine. So I traditionally now will pull off and cut back in springtime instead of winter. And it saves a lot of work not having to deal with rust and black spot all winter long. And then what I would do in my yard, instead of using traditional fertilizers, I would take all the stuff on the bed which had dead rose petals and dead leaves mixed with it, take all that mulch on the surface and throw it in my backyard into my fruit trees. And then the way I would treat my bed is I'd layer this garden compost about a ½ inch deep over the entire bed. This has green waste, chicken manure, wood shavings, compost, rice hulls all in there. So it's quite nutritious. If you go about a ½ inch deep, 3/4 inch deep over the entire bed, this is actually enough nutrition in here to feed them the entire year. That's what I found out in my yard. If I put this that deep over my bed, now chicken manure works fine too. This is probably about a third chicken in here. And then that would be for nutrition. And then to make the front yard bed look better and stop the weeds and insulate the ground, then I cover it with about 2 or 3 inches of bark. This is the real finely ground up bark. Not as nugget like the bigger chunks of bark. This stuff does decompose away within about a year. So every year I would just renew it. Again, I'd scrape off all the old stuff, throw it in the backyard, and put that layer down, put this layer on top. This would be about 3 times thicker than that. And away I'd go for the entire next year. This would stop about 90% of the weeds.
But it's that thick. What happens when you get close to the things? I mean, you know what I'm saying? If you have a rose and you've got the things coming out from the basic stem, you put that much fertilizer in compost, you're going to have it.
Well, this is only,
against the root.
yeah, this garden compost is that thick, and I don't put it right on the rows.
Keep it away.
But it's pretty thin.
Keep it away. I've been putting it down. I'm
Yeah.
just curious.
This is on thick. I mean, this stuff won't hurt.
That can run up against
Yeah, because it's dry. Bark stays really dry. It doesn't decompose anything. Yeah.
So are you saying that if you follow that formula, compost in the bark,
Yeah.
not having to fertilize for the rest of the season?
Right. When I started doing that, I kept looking at my rows, and they just kept growing real fast all year. I said, okay, I don't need to fertilize it. The leaves stay dark green, all the way up and down your stems, and they keep making flowers the average rose flower is 6 weeks. So you have a stem making a flower, and it blooms. You cut that off. 6 weeks later, on average, you have another flower. Now it depends on the time of year. So in the summer, it's 4 weeks. In the winter, it's 8. And it can be longer if it's real cold winter. But you get an average of 1 flower every 6 weeks on the same stem. So if you're getting that, and you get good growth, and your leaves at the base of the plant aren't turning yellow on you, one of the first signs of running out of fertilizer is the older leaves start turning yellow quickly. That would be a sign of lack of fertilizer. Or the center vein in your leaf turns pale yellow, then that's lack of fertilizer. But when I did this, it's like, okay, kept looking at them to watch, and I never need to fertilize them. I started doing the same thing on my grass lawn. Once a year was plenty of fertilizer for it. Just put that on the lawn once a year. Then
But the mulch on your lawn,
the garden compost.
I think it's part of the compost.
Yeah, I stopped using chemical fertilizers because they would only last a couple months. But compost and lawn lasts the entire year.
Is there any particular time of year it matters, or is it like today?
Well, it depends on your lawn. Some lawns, the hot weather lawns like Bermuda and St. Augustine, it makes sense to fertilize them in April because that's the start of their season. But a cool season grass like fescue or bluegrass, and their season is the winter cool season. So September, October makes sense on them. Okay, so you don't have to use these fertilizers at all in the ground, and even in pots, you can just put the garden compost on a layer on top of that pot. Generally, in pots, you'll have to fertilize more than you will in the ground because it flushes through a little faster.
I fertilize every month. Is that what
Probably, but it depends what you're using. I mean, some chemical fertilizers, like if you use a water-soluble fertilizer that you pour on this, you got to do it every 2 weeks because you water it and flushes it out.
or whether it was after the roses flowers?
Oh, this one? Uh-huh.
Well, no, the one in the top.
Okay.
That's the
424. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I have a rose fertilizer by this company too. Once a month may be more than you need, but you can experiment if you like. Yeah. Too much fertilizer doesn't hurt them. I mean, they did a study down in Houston because traditionally in that area, which has climate similar to Sacramento, they actually get a winter. And they wanted to see, traditionally they would fertilize between April and October and don't fertilize after October to allow the rose to rest. But when they did a test study where they just fertilized it through the winter, They said the roses that they fertilized throughout the year looked better than the roses where they stopped in October and started up again in April. So, yeah, you can just fertilize all year. Now, in the old days, we used to sterilize the rose garden in the winter with dormant sprays, thinking that if you sterilize the ground, you stop the diseases for next year. They did that same test in Houston. They got no difference, so we stopped doing that, stopped putting out the dormant sprays. They said there's so many rose spore, disease spores floating in the air. No matter how clean you make your own garden, it makes no difference at all. You'll still get all the same diseases back. So we stopped doing that, where you took the lime sulfur, which is quite dangerous. It's an acid, and sprayed the garden with it to kill the spores on the ground. They said spores don't really survive well on dirt. They usually are the healthiest on the leaf that's still alive. So once you get rid of all the living leaves, the dead leaves on the ground don't really have much spore activity. The spores die on the ground along with the dead leaves. But there's plenty of spores in the air, so it's hard to avoid that. Okay. Now, in the old days, we would seal the cuts on the roses with the pruning sealer. This is a tar-like substance, so when you cut the rose, you'd seal the wound. Now they know that plants seal well. However, there is still a case where we'd use something like this. Doesn't have to be this product, but in some neighborhoods, like when I used to live in Mission Viejo, in Lake Forest, this was happening in Lake Forest. You prune a rose stem, and some insect would come and drill right down into that stem. They noticed the wound there, and they drill right down the center and ate it out. And you'd lose about that much of the end of your rose stems. That's a cane borer. It's called, proper name, raspberry cane borer. Raspberries and roses are closely related. So this cane borer would find all the cut ends of my roses and start drilling them. It didn't kill the plant, of course, but it would drill down about 3 or 4 inches and eat it inside. So I'd have to put some tar on the end of each branch. Now they say don't have to use tar. You can use white glue. You can use fingernail polish, anything you want, so that that bug cannot smell the cut end of that rose, and that would stop it. I haven't seen any damage in this area. When I lived in Mission Viejo, I didn't see any damage there. It was all in Lake Forest, close to riverbeds. So apparently there might have been some wild wild stuff growing there that they were coming from, but you may get a raspberry cane borer drilling out your stems. So we carry that for that. Now, generally in the year, the first thing that happens is aphids. And most of you here should know what aphids are, but they're the first bugs we get on roses every spring, usually in February on the new growth. So on the new growth on the branches, they're about the size of little BBs or smaller when they're born, and usually either green or amber. And there can be 100 on them at the end of a branch, sucking on that. Now, you don't have to treat aphids. What we've noticed is that if we don't treat them, it makes the whole end of that stem sticky. The first flower is sticky. But by the time the first flower is open, all the natural predators have found them and are cleaning them up. So you have either ladybugs, ladybug larvae, lacewing larvae. There are several fly larvae that eat them too. In fact, the most common thing you'll see, of course, here's ladybugs there, lacewing larvae there. The most common thing I always see is something called a syrphid fly larva, which I thought was not a beneficial insect because it's a little green maggot. And I'd find them on every stem of my roses. So the green maggots, there's a fly that's called the bee fly or drone fly also known as a hoverfly. There's this fly you'll see in your rose garden just hovering above the roses, and it does this. It just hovers, goes down, comes back up, hovers, goes down, comes back up. Every time it goes down, it's laying an egg right at the end of the stem of the roses. And out of the egg hatches a little green maggot. And that maggot, they said, can slurp up like 20 aphids a day. That'll clean your roses up real fast. And once the beneficials are there, that's it. The aphids are done for the year. The beneficials just patrol your garden. If you try to kill these with strong pesticides, you might be fighting them the rest of the year. You got to make sure your beneficial insects get out there. Ladybugs are usually the last ones out. The syrphid fly are usually the first ones out. So that's a good bug. Looks nasty, but it's a good bug.
How about the spiders? Are they?
They are, but they don't control. They don't know. They don't. When they're small, they might do the aphids, but the aphids are the main bug we have to stop in the spring, early spring. First bug out. Here's another fly larva, real small maggot from this little midge fly, and they also eat aphids, although they don't eat that many of them. Of course, they can. These midges lay a lot of eggs, so you can get a lot of these little orange maggots, and they'll pupate right on near the buds.
And they don't hurt the flower.
All good guys.
Just adapt naturally with the aphids expecting.
Yeah. Yeah, they smell them. So aphids excrete honeydew, which is sugar water. So if you want to attract more, more beneficials to your yard, you spray your yard with sugar water, because that the beneficials smell that. You go, okay, there's got to be some sucking bugs around here someplace. So they'll smell out the lay eggs in that area. The lacewings will lay eggs wherever they smell the sugar water. There's the different kind of, well, this is a baby ladybug here. And ladybugs do come in different colors. There's a dronefly adult, which looks somewhat like a bee, but it has bigger eyes than bees do. So there's quite a few beneficials. Now there's one nasty bug that we're finding more and more these days. It's the flower thrip. Flower thrips are really small, so flower thrips, if you magnified them a lot, they look like that. But if you don't magnify them, they're about the size of a sliver. And what they do is, usually you start seeing them around April. As the flower bud opens, this is a western flower thrip. As that flower bud opens, this guy will land on it. It's got little wings and lay maybe 50 eggs on that bud. And the larvae hatch out immediately and get underneath the petals and start sucking on them. So all the outer petals of your flowers have brown edges. The inner petals they never got to, but the outer petals have brown edges. If you just pull those petals off, the rest of the flower looks fine. These thrips are attracted to the lighter colors, white, yellow, light pink, light orange. They don't seem to like red. So to stop these guys, you can just go out there and spray the very tip of the bud with this spinosad soap. So spinosad is the best thrip killer around. Now, we're not supposed to recommend it forever, but it does kill thrips really well. You should alternate in the garden eventually to prevent resistance to a pesticide, because this only kills 95% of all thrips. There'll be a few that survive this, and if you just keep using this one product the life of your rose plants, you'll end up with a bunch of thrips that aren't killed by this stuff anymore. That's why we carry this product here. This is a chemical. This is non-organic. This is organic. Once in a while you use something like this to control the thrips, but if you use this most of the time, this last 2 weeks, although the problem we have with roses is that new flower buds open up every week. So it's almost like you have to go out every week, find the new flower buds just starting to open, and spray just the bud. That's all you got to do is spray the bud with that or this. So minimal pesticide use in your garden, and keep those strips out of the flowers. If you do it consistently for 2 weeks, you'll break the cycle. So what?
Don't spray the leaves, just the bud.
Right. They're only in the bud. The western flower strip is only in the flower buds. Now their life cycle is they spend about a week or two in the flower bud, drop to the ground, pupate, fly back up as an adult, reinfect. If you do this for a couple of weeks straight, that kind of stops the cycle, and you won't see them again the rest of the year. So now the problem we have is that we've got a new thrip in California now. Came from India by way of Cuba. I think it was in India, then it was in Florida, and then it came across to Texas and California about 20 years ago. No, maybe not that long ago. It's only about 8 years ago. The chili thrip. Trip's always spelled with an S on the end. You know how you do a multiple thrips. Thrippy? I don't know. But chili thrips. Looks the same. It's really tiny. But this thing comes out when it's hot. So this year we didn't see much of this at all. We only got hot enough, say at the end of August, to have many chili thrips, and it got so cold again by the end of September, they didn't have much time this year. Last year was nasty because we were hot in February. We hit 80 degrees in February last year. We had 100 degrees in April. So the chili thrips out early. The chili thrips not only go after the flower buds, but they'll go after all the new leaves that are made on each growth cycle. And they'll just turn them all brown and crispy. You can have on one stem this long over 100 chili thrips feeding on that branch. They just suck it dry. Now they do a number on chili plants, tomatoes, any plant that's growing fast during hot weather, the chili thrips can go after. They said 250 types of plants in your yard they can affect. But it's mainly the plants that are growing quickly, and the roses show the most damage of any plant we've seen, where it just shuts down the growth and flowers altogether. Some areas you don't see it. Along the coast it's not, and they like it hot. Chili thrips like it hot. I mean, if you're in Texas, you're fighting chili thrips from May through October. Here, we don't usually get it till August, late July, early August, September, sometimes into October if the fall is warm. But it makes all the new growth just turn brown and shrivel up. So then you got to hit it really good with this. Well, they don't operate during cool temperatures.
What I'm saying is that, is there a latent infestation on the roses, or does it always endure temporarily?
We don't know where they spend the winter. They might spend it as a pupa on the ground. But, well, they're here to stay, let's put it that way.
So once you get them on your flower, you're going to have a chance to eradicate them.
Well, we don't know what happens with chili thrips and thrips. Some years they're worse than others, both of them, and some years they're not as bad.
I had some, I thought were chili thrips, but they haven't been in now for quite a while.
Right.
I don't know if they were just regular thrips.
Yeah, it's possible that all that rain we had earlier this year messed them up a lot too, but we don't know. We just expect them to be here. So in our nursery, on our own roses, we're spraying all the time for them, for both thrips. We want to just make sure that they're not on the plants. Right. But yeah, you may not have to spray them that as much as they say. We don't know. But you can keep your eye on it. So the thrips are the major problem in roses these days. Of course, we're near the coast, and the biggest problem near the coast is that the humidity and the temperatures cause mildew. So powdery mildew, which is this white fuzzy stuff that gets on the new growth and on the flower buds and the stems, has always been the #1 disease in Orange County. We do get rust, which causes the orange and yellow spots, but that occurs when it rains, primarily when it rains. We do get black spot here too when it rains, but again, when it rains, and our rainy season is January through up until April. So black spots look like vague black spots, big black spots on the leaves. So we don't worry about black spot and rust as much because that's happening before we clean up our roses in the spring. But mildew is a problem. So mildew likes temperatures between 55 and 85 degrees. That range is mildew weather, and humid weather on top of that. So that usually happens from late April through early July. This year went longer because we had July wasn't hot. It was still spring weather in July, so we had to go a little longer this year. Now, there are regular chemical pesticides for powdery mildew. But this year, the one that worked the best for us, and one we'll just use again instead of going to the chemicals, was the oil baking soda mix. So we have this all seasons oil, which is a mineral oil, considered organic because it just evaporates after it sits for a while. It evaporates all seasons oil and baking soda. This year's mildew was so bad, worst we've ever seen, that my regular pesticides didn't do anything on the mildew. This cured it. So we did, in 1 gallon of water, we added 4 tablespoons of all seasons oil and 1 tablespoon of baking soda. Mixed it all together in that gallon of water, sprayed it on the new growth of the roses, stopped the mildew cold. The oil kills a lot of bugs too. I mean, back in the 80s, before we had all of the serious bug and disease problems, so if you go back to the 1980s, we didn't have black spot. We didn't have chili thrips. We didn't have a disease called downy. All we had to do on our roses once a week at the nursery was spray this combination on them, which is considered an organic spray, and no problems. I mean, I thought, boy, growing roses was really easy and nice because this cured everything. Unfortunately, the chili thrips came in, so it doesn't work quite as well as it did back in the 80s. So if you do this 1 week and the spinosad the other week, that might stop those chili thrips and the other thrips on top of that pretty good, along with all the other insects. So spinosad not only kills thrips really well, it kills all the chewing bugs, things that make holes in your roses. There are, near the coast especially, there's a bug called a rose slug. Not a slug, it's a larva of a stingless wasp that laces out the lower leaves of your rose plant. This will stop it. There are little caterpillars in the summer that might eat your flower buds, make a hole right in them, and then the fig beetles also like to eat rose flower buds. This will stop them too. So this combination's not bad. with baking soda. That'll stop most of the pests in your garden and the diseases too. Now, Bayer made a lot of money back in the 80s when roses were at their peak by putting out a systemic product that you just pour on the dirt that does all this stuff. Controls mildew, controls all the bugs. It's got fertilizer in it also. They're taking this off the market. So we may not be able to carry it anymore because this has imidacloprid in it, which is a systemic pesticide. And this systemic has been implicated in sudden bee death. Now we know it kills bees, but it doesn't kill the hive. Several universities have said they haven't found any of this chemical in the hives. It kills the bees. They never make it back to the hive, so you don't want to use it, but it's not what's causing the big bee death across the United States. That's due to a disease that was carried by a mite. Still not good to do. They said this is, as far as honeybees goes, this isn't the worst thing in the world. However, the native bees, which are solitary bees, you'll wipe them out. And we don't want to do that. So this is being taken off the market. We still use this chemical systemic on plants that don't have flowers that the bees come to, like ornamental ficus, certain plants that don't bloom. We still use this to control disease, pine trees, elm trees, they don't have flowers, things like that. We'll still use it for bug control on them because you just put it on the dirt and it makes the whole plant poisonous. But for things that bloom, that's becoming a no-no, total no-no. Okay. Any other questions on the roses? I think I covered everything. Amount of water they use, well, roses like it pretty wet. 4 foot by 3 foot high, you're probably getting about a gallon or 2 a day. So if you're sitting next to a tree, you got to water, make sure the tree gets enough water too, else your roses run dry. So trees can use tremendous amounts of water, like a big eucalyptus tree, 100 gallons of water a day in the summer. It's really hard to grow roses next to big trees unless you make sure the tree has enough water as far as it needs it, because it'll just take it from the rose. Now roses have proven to be quite drought resistant. When we noticed that when we had that 5-year drought, was that 2012 to 2017, and they cut all the water backs in all the parks, and you did it in your yard too, cut it back 20%. The roses did not look good, but most of them made it through that. So roses are considered a moderate water user, not a high water user. Like ferns would be a high. Losing a lot of daylilies in the parks, a lot of regular shrubs. Flax plants were dying from the drought, but the roses all seem to have made it through that. So they're not as high a water user as we used to think they were. The other thing I'll mention too, I didn't mention, there is, just like any other plant, there is a replant syndrome. So if you have an old rose garden, you take one out, pull it out of the ground, replant it with a new one in the same soil, it won't grow. It just doesn't grow. You've got to replace the soil with at least 1 bag of our potting soil, either one, or a couple bags of sand, which is cheaper, something like that, or just dirt from another part of your yard that doesn't grow roses. So they suffer from the same replant syndrome that any other plant does. I didn't know this when I had my first rose garden. I had 50 rose garden, and I'd get bored from the roses after a few years, pull it out, put a new one in. The ones next to it, which were the original roses, were growing just fine, blooming, blooming, growing. The new one between those two would put on a few leaves, one bloom on each stem, and that's it. It wouldn't do anything the rest of the year. And after a few years of that, I just pulled it out and planted a hibiscus in its place, and the hibiscus did fine. But the roses, when I didn't know what was going on, then we read about the replant syndrome. It first appeared in the American Rose Society's handbook in the I think around 1990, late 80s. Rose replant syndrome. Go, okay, that's what happened. So, so if you put something unrelated to a rose in there, no problem. Or if you just put dirt in that wasn't growing a rose before, the new rose did fine. One of my employees, who was a rosarian, had 100 rose garden. He says, yeah, one bag of either one of our potting soils would do perfect for his new roses. Enough dirt to grow a good rose.
Is there a typical life to plant?
Well, that's a good question. Roses, I've always been said 10 years should be about right. Sometimes it's not quite that good. And we've had some people tell us they've had their roses for 30 years. Now, what always kills them, what makes them go downhill, is the fact that any plant, and the reason why plants get old in the first place, they build up a lot of dead roots around them. So eventually there's no place for the root habitat anymore. Everything around it's dead rose root. So it kills them. Or they just get so ugly that it's not worth having them. But some of the rose gardens, what they would do is they would trench in front of the roses and put new dirt in. And that gives them a new root run area close to the plant. So they do that when they cut them back in the winter. They just trench and put new dirt in, and suddenly those roses would do a lot better because they had, quote, virgin soil to grow into again. So you can do that on old roses to revive them also. But sometimes, they get so covered with bark, there's no place for any new growth to come out. Sometimes that happens too. So it's time to replace. Okay. All right.